Factsverse presents. This bizarre photo caused mayhem. Try not to gasp when you see why. Photographs tell a million stories. We take pictures to capture moments, record a narrative, or just preserve evidence. In this series of photos, history is unveiled and the many different stories are retold once more. Before we get into our video, help us spread the word about Factsverse by clicking that like button. Also be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our future videos. Children licking ice blocks. New York City, July 1912. New York had just survived a heat wave the year before that killed nearly 500 people along the eastern seaboard when this photo was taken. There'd been no rain, and it was summer. Kids wanted to play outside, but the heat was stifling. Ice blocks, often used to keep food and drinks cold, were delivered to homes via trucks. These ice blocks, they would have been out on the streets for delivery, but they also provided a cool relief for thirsty young children. A payphone in HAIGHT-ASHBURY, San Francisco, 1969. In 1969, many payphones ran on the Bell system, which required an operator. This payphone took nickels, dimes, and quarters for each call. The horizontal metal strip on the top part of the phone had holes cut to the size of the coins. When coins were dropped, they made distinct sounds as they fell, allowing the operator to know how much money was paid for a call. HAIGHT-ASHBURY at the time was at the center of the hippie movement, and this payphone even came with a friendly handwritten reminder. A young boy watching TV through a store window, 1948. Although the first television was invented in the late 20s, it was still a rarity in the 1940s when this photo of a young boy wearing a suit was taken. It explains the entranced look on the boy's face as he watches the tiny screen. That year, less than 1% of households in the U.S. had a TV, and it'd be several more years before color TV sets would ever hit the market. TVs were displayed in shop windows to attract buyers. They were also often used by passers-by to watch the news or any show that happened to be on at that time. Young girl and her kitten on a leash, 1931. December 2, 1931, the National Cat Club show was held at the Crystal Palace in London. This photo shows a young exhibitor leading her beloved cat to the show. The Crystal Palace holds a historic significance for cat shows, and it was here where the first official feline show was staged in July of 1871. Since the Crystal Palace was considered a high-end venue then, the events held were often high-profile celebrations. The show was organized by Harrison Weir, an artist and cat lover who wanted to promote the care and appreciation for domestic cats. The 10,000-Calorie Sundae, 1950s. This image of two girls buying an ice cream sundae was taken in Lynchburg, Virginia at Blair Parsons' store. The small store became famous in the local area because of this addition to their menu. Although the sundae looked delicious, it probably did not come close to the 10,000-calorie claim, the brainchild of the owner himself. Most hot fudge sundaes that time would tip the calorie scales at about 300 calories or less. The ones that were sold in Parsons' store were not exactly mega-sized. The price of a sundae when that photo was taken was, believe it or not, only 35 cents. Restoration of the Great Wall, circa 1900s. This image of the Great Wall of China was taken by Herbert G. Ponting in 1907. Although rather casual, the photo was not just randomly taken to capture China's enduring monument. The inclusion of the people in the foreground was a nod to the standard photographic technique at the time. With people present for scale, the viewer can appreciate the size of the wall. The men in the photo are still wearing the hairstyle known as Q, often worn by the Manchu, Jurchen, and later by the men of the Qing dynasty. When Helen Keller saw Dwight Eisenhower. Helen Keller was not even 2 years old when she lost her sight and hearing. With the help of caring teachers, she overcame her disabilities and became an educator, author, and advocate. During the Second World War, Keller would visit veterans who had become disabled after being wounded, and then President Dwight Eisenhower invited Keller to the White House to personally thank her. She was accompanied by her guide, Polly Thomason. Keller had wanted to see the president's famous smile, and when she was close to him she raised her hand and touched Ike's face to feel what he looked like. Her way of seeing. Smith College's basketball team, Women's Division, 1902. Women's basketball owes a lot to Smith College. This historic photo shows the first women's basketball team courtesy of Smith College in 1902. Smith College also had the honor of having Senda Berenson on board. She was a gymnastics instructor who's credited as the matriarch of women's basketball. The baskets that hold some of the women's players were actually the hoops used in the game. When the ball entered these baskets, they were simply retrieved by someone on a ladder. Later, a small hole was drilled through the basket so a stick could be used to push the ball out. The first hoop and backboard weren't set up until 1906. Women's tennis at the Olympic Games, summer 1900. This photo captured a remarkable moment in Olympic history. The Summer Olympics in 1900 was the first time women were allowed to participate, thanks to the introduction of golf and lawn tennis to the competitions. Tennis had grown popular, and women took to the sport eagerly, unfazed by the attire they were required to wear. They had to wear high collars, long sleeves, and long skirts that hid their ankles. The color white was associated with wealth, and so was tennis, which explains the choice of color in the dresses the women had to wear. The Godfather, a behind-the-scenes look, 1972. The Godfather catapulted director Francis Ford Coppola to superstardom, along with the film's stars. In this photo, James Caan and Robert Duvall are shown in a scene with the incomparable Marlon Brando. The notorious Brando, while magnificent as Don Vito Corleone, did not memorize his lines. Instead, he had cue cards printed and taped on objects on the set where he could read them. Here, Duvall is seen holding up the cue cards just beyond the camera's view. Marilyn Monroe in New York City on a 56 Thunderbird. Marilyn Monroe owned this 1956 Ford T-Bird convertible until her death in 1962. The Raven Black Roadster was the wedding car she and Arthur Miller rode in when they married. In many images of Monroe with this car, Miller was often the one in the driver's seat. Just a short time before she died, she gave the car to John Strasberg to celebrate his 18th birthday. The T-Bird was sold at an auction later in 2018 for $490,000. Three-story outhouse, St. Louis, circa 1800s. Outhouses, while relegated to the farthest part of the yard and often the target of snickering juvenile humor, served a very important job in maintaining sanitary conditions. While we are more familiar with the solitary single-story outhouse standing lonely in a field, there was a time when these structures were built for multiple users. This particular outhouse, located at the back of Franklin Avenue, served 12 families. The first underwater portrait, 1893. The very first underwater photographs were taken in 1856, but this self-portrait was taken in 1893 by Louis Button in a laboratory in Banyuls-sur-Mer. Button was studying underwater biology and decided to build his own camera to take a photo of himself in complete immersion. Button was one of the pioneers in underwater photography, creating a flash system for underwater snapshots and a watertight seal for the camera. He was inspired by the beauty that he saw underwater and wanted to capture it for others to see. With his brother Augusta, an engineer, he developed a camera system that allowed him to bring the wonders of underwater to the surface through pictures. Jim Morrison on stage, September 1968. On December 15, 1968, the Doors were scheduled for a concert in Amsterdam. Prior to the show, the band members headed off to the area's famed red light district with members of Jefferson Airplane. Fans eagerly offered them herbal drugs. Unlike his bandmates, Morrison tried everything at once. Jefferson Airplane was the opening act that night, and while they were on stage, Morrison came out and began to spin in circles. The band decided to play faster and faster to encourage Morrison to twirl faster as well. In a few moments, he promptly collapsed and passed out on stage. Two Boys on a Trip to Space, 1955. In 1955, when these boys were out and about in Fort Worth, Texas, Americans were still in the throes of the Cold War. However, this was also the era that marked the advent of the space age. People were becoming more and more aware of the world beyond and the possibilities of spaceflight. The planetarium offered these boys a chance to experience life in space, and the wonders of what they saw are etched on their faces. Santa Claus for the Poor, Chicago, 1902. Santa Claus has always been a symbol of hope and joy during the holidays. Here he's standing in the streets of Chicago in 1902, holding a sign asking people to donate to the poor of the city. The man in the photo was actually a member of the Volunteers of America, a nonprofit organization that provides assistance to low-income Americans. The man's not wearing a padded suit but had put on a mask with a beard to try and look the part. German fraternity mirror selfie, 1912. At first glance, there's really nothing significantly special about this picture, just a group of men taking a photo of themselves in front of a mirror. These men were having fun, hamming it up for the camera, with one man in the background even raising a saber and the other a rifle. What makes the image poignant, though, is that just 2 years later, World War I would begin. The war to end all wars turned out to become one of the deadliest in human history, later followed by genocides and an influenza pandemic in 1918. But in this photo, war was still far away, and it was time to smile and take a picture. Woman on a beach, Tel Aviv, 1948. War was over, and the beach was beckoning. This photo shows a woman playing badminton on a sunny day, framed by the sea and the shipwreck of the Altalena. The ship was at the center of a conflict between the Jewish paramilitary group Irgun and the Israel Defense Forces. The Altalena was loaded with Irgun fighters and weapons. It was shelled by the Israeli forces and a fight broke out on the beach. The incident nearly caused a civil war. Eiffel Tower Rising, 1887. France's iconic structure wasn't built in a day, but when it was finally completed after 2 years, it was, and still is, considered a technical feat. The construction of the Eiffel Tower began January 28, 1887. It's named after Alexander Gustav Eiffel, the engineer and owner of the company that designed and later built the tower. The Iron Lady consists of over 18,000 wrought iron pieces and over 2 million rivets. Its completion was meant to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution in 1889. Electric car charging, 1912. Neither the Tesla Roadster nor the Nissan Leaf is the first electric car to run on the roads. As early as the 1830s, America and European innovators had made plans to develop vehicles that ran on battery power. However, it was only in 1890 when the first electric car that ran successfully debuted in the U.S. Electric cars were believed to be more popular with women at the time because, unlike gas-powered cars, they did not need a hand crank to start. Charging points were installed along the roads, so electric car owners had access to power at any time. A llama in New York, 1956. In 1956, New Yorkers in Times Square beheld an out-of-the-ordinary sight – a llama with its head stuck out of a car. This llama was actually a celebrity. Named Linda the Llama, she sat in the back seat of a car that her trainer owned. She and other animals had just appeared on television at an ABC Studios show and were on their way home. Linda was one of a menagerie of animals that appeared on TV. Not shown with her were her companion cats, dogs, birds, a kangaroo, a miniature bull, and a pig. Young Indian boy bitten by a viper, India. The young boy in this photo being attended by doctors was bitten by a Russell's viper, one of the deadliest venomous snakes found in the Indian subcontinent. The Russell's viper is so feared it's often referred to as one of the Big Four. It's also the second most active of the group in terms of the number of victims. The bite of the Russell's viper causes pain, vomiting, dizziness, and swelling. If the victim is not given immediate treatment, the bite could lead to kidney failure and blood incoagulability. Thankful for this boy, his father had killed the snake and brought it to the hospital to be identified. The boy was then given the proper anti-venom treatment. The Pyramids of Giza, circa 1860 to 1880. When a photographer, Felix Bonfils, took this picture, Egypt was still under Ottoman rule. The three famous pyramids were estimated to have been built over 4,500 years previously. These structures actually housed burial complexes meant to guarantee a safe resting place for their old kings. The largest of the pyramids, towering some 147 meters, was Pharaoh Khufu's Great Project. Around 2.3 million blocks of stone, weighing as much as 15 tons, make up this pyramid. The Great Pyramid is flanked by Pharaoh Khafre's Pyramid and Pharaoh Menkawer's, which is the smallest. The Sphinx is actually a part of Khafre's necropolis. Preserved dinosaur tracks, Texas. When dinosaurs walked the Earth, they also walked on Texas. Prehistoric limestone in the Paluxy River preserved these steps forever. Initially, the discovery of the tracks in the 1930s was very controversial due to some claims by the locals that human footprints accompanied the dinosaur tracks. It was later proven a hoax, however. The Paluxy trackways featured plenty of footprints, with some prints discovered way back in 1908. One of the most popular is known as the Chase sequence, featuring tracks made by a group of sauropods being followed by a few theropods. A digital walkthrough of the chase was created in 2014 to show the extent of the fossilized trackway. San Francisco after an earthquake, 1906. On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., San Francisco was rocked by a magnitude 7.9 earthquake which escalated to a strength rated with a Mercalli intensity of 11 or extreme. The shaking lasted from 45 to 60 seconds. The earthquake not only destroyed many roads and buildings, but it also caused fires to break out. It took several days for the fires to be put out. The earthquake destroyed 80% of San Francisco, and as many as 3,000 people were killed. It is considered California's worst natural disaster due to the number of lives lost in its wake. The earthquake occurred before the Richter scale was developed, so the figure that was given as a measurement of the intensity is just an estimate. Some estimates, though, place the magnitude as a 7.7. Others place it as high as 8.3. American soldier helping a woman and her child. Saipan, 1944. On June 15, 1944, the U.S. Marines attacked the beaches of the island of Saipan, which belonged to the Japanese. As part of the Pacific Campaign to gain some leverage, the Americans needed the island as a base for their B-29 bombers. Their plan was to push the Japanese forces to the north, where they would be trapped. The Japanese forces proved to be tough, determined, and highly capable. The fighting intensified, especially since the Japanese encouraged both soldiers and civilians on the island to avoid being caught alive. They also launched a massive banzai charge that took the lives of more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers. There was also a rumor that Emperor Hirohito had issued an order to civilians to commit suicide to avoid being taken as prisoners. While this photo shows a sympathetic American soldier helping a woman and her child, there were other aspects of the fighting in Saipan that were just brutal. Most of the Marines were very wary of underground shelters or bunkers because they were unsure if the civilians were unarmed. To be safe, they used their flamethrowers on these shelters without investigating thoroughly. Louis Armstrong at the Pyramids, 1961. Louis Armstrong, along with a host of America's best talents, were sent by the American government on a diplomatic journey across the East. The goal was to promote America's way of life through the music that was born and raised in America – jazz. Armstrong, along with the likes of Dizzy Gillespie, Dave Brubeck, and Duke Ellington, traveled to Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Jordan, among others. Armstrong, along with his wife Lucille, traveled to Egypt as part of his African and Middle East Goodwill Tour. In this photo, Satchmo poses and plays for Lucille as she and the Sphinx listen intently. First Class Cafe, RMS Titanic, circa 1912. Royal Mail ship Titanic was on its maiden voyage from England to New York City when it sank April 1912. It took with it 1,500 passengers and crew. But before its demise, the Titanic was a glorious ship. It was a luxury liner with lavishly styled first-class facilities. The photo depicts the Café Parisien, a Parisian-style café located on the B deck. The café featured white trellises from which real live English ivy hung, and the room featured a green carpet. On Titanic's last night, the Café Parisien offered salmon, sirloin of beef, oysters, pâté de foie gras, chartreuse jelly with peaches, and eclairs with vanilla and chocolate. Galician immigrants in Quebec, circa 1890s. The Galicians were a group of people who lived in the region between Eastern and Central Europe. The first records of Galician Ukrainian settlers who came to Canada appeared in 1891. It's possible there were others before them. In the following years, tens of thousands of immigrants from Ukraine arrived. The adults in the family of 7 were probably skilled in industrial occupations, which explains why they chose Quebec. However, during the First World War, Galicians were considered enemy aliens by the Canadian government. More than 5,000 were sent off to internment camps. In spite of the mistrust, more than 10,000 of these people fought for Canada in the war. To avoid mistreatment and discrimination, they anglicized their names. Railroad exhibit, Baltimore, Maryland, 1927. In November 1927, a railroad exhibit dubbed the Fair of the Iron Horse was held by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroads in celebration of its 100th year. The B&O was the first steam-powered railway in the U.S. to be used as a freight and passenger carrier. It was established by Baltimore merchants so they could compete with New York businessmen. The locomotive and coaches shown in the photo were collectively called the Atlantic. It was a reconstruction project for the B&O. The Atlantic was originally built in 1832 but was retired in 1893. After D-Day, 1944. The Battle of Normandy was fought from June to August of 1944. It was fought by the Allied forces to liberate Western Europe from Germany. Although the code name for the attack was Operation Overlord, it became popularly known as D-Day. The 156,000-strong Allied army was composed of Americans, Canadians, and British soldiers who descended on Normandy Beach on amphibious vehicles. It was one of the most ambitious and largest military assaults ever in history. D-Day is remarkable in that it involved extensive planning to deceive Nazi Germany and mislead the German forces stationed in France. Over 4,000 men from the Allied troops gave their lives that day, and thousands more were wounded. A good number of the men who stormed the beach that day also went missing. By June 11th, the beaches of Normandy were considered safe and secure for the Allied forces. Sean Connery with Claudine Auger, 1965. The movie Thunderball is Sean Connery's 4th outing as James Bond. A fan favorite, this film featured sharks, a jetpack, a real working one, and a stunning underwater fight scene. The sharks used in the film were real and alive. During a shoot, a large gap in the partition that separated Connery from the sharks allowed one creature to swim through, nearly finding its way to the actor who escaped just in time. In this photo, Connery is relaxing on the beach set with actress Claudine Auger, former Miss France and Miss World runner-up. Auger beat hundreds of beauties who auditioned for the role of Domino, including Faye Dunaway, Julie Christie, and Raquel Welch. North Vietnamese warrior couple, Vietnam, 1971. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975. It was a conflict between the Communist North Vietnamese and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese enjoyed support from Communist allies, including China and the Soviet Union, while the South Vietnamese were supported by the U.S., Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, and South Korea. The fighting was prolonged, bitter, and brutal, but in the very short interim between the fighting, there were special moments. In this photo, 2 soldiers of the North Vietnamese walk side by side, holding hands. The thin man and the slight woman by his side are walking towards the water, their weapons hanging from their backs nearly as long as their bodies. It's a casual stroll yet stilted, thanks to the Soviet-issued helmets and Mosin Nagant M1891s. It would take 4 more years from the time this picture was taken for the war to stop. Jean Devereaux, first female hairstylist in the U.S., 1927. In the 1920s, women did not enjoy a lot of freedom, especially in the type of career they would like to pursue. Even after the 19th Amendment was passed giving women the right to vote, many women and men still believed that there should be a clear delineation of men's and women's roles. Change was coming, though, and it was unstoppable. In this photo, Jean Devereaux is shown shaving a customer, something that only male barbers were allowed to do before her. Although women were allowed to work in salons in Europe, the U.S. was rather slow in joining the bandwagon. Thanks to pioneers like Jean Devereaux, jobs that were once considered traditionally male-only have become opportunities for women as well. Hotel Alcazar Bathing Pool, Florida, 1889. The Hotel Alcazar was built from 1887 to 1889. It was a part of a building complex that featured Spanish Moorish architecture. The design elements for Hotel Alcazar was inspired by the Moorish structures in Spain. The builders spent more than $1 million putting this hotel together, which was a fortune at the time. Easily the hotel's most distinctive features are its Russian and Turkish baths. The water was supplied by a natural, free-flowing artesian well that was believed to have medicinal properties. The baths were situated next to the casino, where people could attend social functions and watch dances and other entertainment. Charles C. Ebbets on the GE Building. Charles C. Ebbets was an American photographer who snapped some of the most famous photographs in the country. The famous Lunch Atop a Skyscraper, which featured a construction worker eating lunch while seated on a crossbeam, was one of his works. Originally, the photographer was not identified, and the credit for the photo was labeled unknown. Some invoices and photos of Ebbets working on site were later discovered, and this photo was finally credited to him. The Michigan Wolverines, 1907. The Michigan Wolverines played for the University of Michigan during the college football season of 1907, and they finished with a record of 5-1. Their center was German Schultz, who was chosen as a first-team All-American. He was also named as the greatest football center of all time by the NFL. Michigan holds the distinction of being the institution with the most number of all-time wins in the history of college football. New York City Market, 1900s. The streets on Lower Manhattan's west side were once lined by street vendors. In the 1900s, vendors came out to sell their wares on carts and makeshift stalls. Many of the vendors were farmers who came with their produce from surrounding farmlands, setting up wholesale markets that sold fruits, vegetables, and everything else. Other food items were supplied from boats that docked on the Hudson and East River. A Highway Picnic, 1973. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, decided to stop exporting petroleum to the U.S. The embargo began in October that year. As expected, there was a spike in oil prices all over the country. Not only were the prices inflated, but the supply was limited as well. On average, 1 gallon of gasoline before the embargo was sold at 38.5 cents. During the embargo, it was 55 cents. With high prices and little supply, it was no surprise that America's highways were largely empty of cars, hence the picnic pictured here. Mimes in Central Park, New York City, 1974. Photographer Daniel Soreen took pictures of 2 mimes performing in Central Park. Soreen was an up-and-coming photographer who used the New York City streets as his studio. 35 years later, he realized that one of the mimes had gone on to do bigger things. One of the mimes was Todd Oppenheimer. The other was Robin Williams. Subscribe for more.